good morning to all of you. So today, my dear friends, we discuss corporate governance today. I don't know whether you are familiar with this topic or not, but being students or academicians, this is something everyone is aware of now, corporate governance. In fact, governance is the buzzword everywhere, whether it be the government or in the corporate circles or in any organization for that matter. Now, we'll be confining our discussion only to corporate governance and not the governance at large. Now, for long, we have judged and evaluated the performance of companies on the basis of their profitability and growth, on the basis of their turnover, net worth, or profits. Even when we have judged companies on the basis of their efficiency in management, the focus has been on optimal utilization of resources for maximum efficiency and financial gains. But the new trend is to judge companies on the basis of their corporate governance performance, which is not confined to financial performance or simply resource utilization or efficiency in operations. Rather, the new trend is to examine and evaluate the companies on the basis of their institutional mechanisms, organizational structures, and processes, systems, and means which they adopt for achieving their targets, goals, and for harmonizing and balancing the competing interests of different stakeholders. Now, hypothetically, there may be a case of a company making less profits than its rivals, but scoring better or higher in the corporate governance index. Now, good corporate governance practices most certainly give each such company a competitive edge over the others, over its rivals. And therefore, we have seen a slight shift from management to corporate governance these days. Management is something I don't think I have to tell you about because you must be aware of what management is all about. But just to recap in 1 or 2 sentences, management is all about harmonizing, harnessing, and effectively deploying all resources available to a company to achieve certain prescribed goals and targets, so that it may continue to grow and profit. It's concerned with day-to-day operations. Management is task-oriented. It's focused on performance, on targets, on goals. And at best, it seeks to bring about a coordination within the various departments of a company to achieve these common targets and goals. In corporate governance, the emphasis is given to design some robust organization structure with appropriate checks and balances mechanism within the organization to achieve these goals. In corporate governance, importance is given to means, to the processes of attaining these objectives by embedding ethical business values in the corporate work culture. That's very important. Means, they give emphasis to means. And by designing procedures and processes which adhere to these ethical business values. And in corporate governance, they factor in or they give a lot of importance to transparency and accountability. In whatever means that they adopt, transparency and accountability has to be factored in. Of course, you may say that even in management, means don't justify, ends don't justify the means. That is, means are important in management too, of course. The processes are important, but I would say in the case of corporate governance, the emphasis on means, on processes, on procedures, on fairness in decision-making is more pronounced than in management. Moreover, in the case of corporate governance, the process of monitoring the performance of the company, for example, is more open and transparent. Therefore, there is emphasis on... Somebody said something? Okay, that must be a disturbance. So I was saying, in the case of corporate governance, the emphasis is on reporting and disclosure of performance to all stakeholders. Also, there's one more difference between management and the corporate governance. Corporate governance involves managing and harmoniously balancing the complex set of relationship between the management and the board on the one hand, and the shareholders and the stakeholders on the other. And in corporate governance, you normally cater to the triple bottom line. I don't know whether you heard the term triple bottom line in management. It's a term which is coined by John Elkington. And it says that the bottom line for the companies, that is, the focus of their performance should not only be one singular objective, that is profits, but it should be three P's. It should be profits, planet, and people. That is, they should not only look after the economic concern, but also the social and environmental concerns. So corporate governance, they say, caters to all these three P's. In fact, some of the experts, scholars, and also the business leaders, some of them, that say that their corporate governance caters to four P's. They have defined it differently. And these four P's, according to them, are performance, people, processes, and purpose. Performance, of course, is evaluated in terms of the targets achieved, which is absolutely essential for any company. And people, by people, they mean business should be people-centric and people-oriented. When they talk of processes, as I said, the processes means the means adopted for achieving these targets or the goals are as important as the targets themselves. And the fourth P, the purpose, they say that the business of purpose should be, the purpose of business should be to do good for society and for the environment. It's not something that they do only for themselves, only for the company, but also for society and environment. So broadly, they all seem to be saying the same thing in different form or manner. SEBI, of course, you must have heard of SEBI, the market regulator, the Security Exchange Board of India. SEBI has actually defined corporate governance. They say it is a set of systems, processes, and principles. See the emphasis on systems, processes, and principles, which ensure that a company is governed in the best interest of all the stakeholders. So it's a very succinct definition they have given or explanation to corporate governance and emphasized on the right points. Stakeholders is there, systems, processes, and principles are there. Now, I would say perhaps the most difficult task in corporate governance is to manage and balance the complex set of relationship between the shareholders and the stakeholders. While doing so, while trying to arrive at a very harmonious equation between the two, the company has to hold steady its course for the growth, profitability, and expansion of the company. That is always there. I am not undermining the importance of profits or the growth and profitability of a company. That always remains the centerpiece. But alongside with this, they have to manage and balance the equation between the shareholders and the stakeholders, which can be a difficult task. And mind you that the range of stakeholders is constantly increasing these days. And you have in stakeholders, groups like the investors, you have the creditors, you have the clients, you have the service providers, you have the employees, you have the government, you have the community at large, and environment and ecology is also part of the stakeholder. Now, with so much emphasis being given to environmental issues, to ecological preservation, to global warming and climate change issues, the corporations, that is businesses or the trade and industry, are considered to be very important actors having a very strategic role to play in bringing about transformation in this sphere. Therefore, I mean, if I were to sum up and or whatever I've said, I would say that corporate governance has to deal with a host of issues. It has to face a host of challenging issues, and it has to deal with complex trade-offs. And therefore, if any company is able to demonstrate good corporate governance and has a good track record in corporate governance, it certainly has a competitive edge over the others. So this is a business case also for doing good corporate governance. And we can see how companies, give you some examples, time permitting, I'll give you some examples of companies who have not performed well on corporate governance fronts. They have collapsed. But I must clarify here that the corporate governance, even that circles across the world, there are variations in its conceptual definition. Each country, each system, each setup can give its own definition of corporate governance, or even about the structural framework. It can vary. The legal instrumentalities which are considered to be ensuring good corporate governance, they can vary. The processual requirements can vary from country to country or system to system. And even sometimes even the expected outcomes as to what you expect out of good corporate governance, that can be slightly different from the others, what the others perceive. So therefore, I would say there is no single best model of corporate governance applicable to all the countries because of the differences in their business environment, their legal and institutional framework, which is quite different. The characteristics of the corporate sector also may be different. The political and government systems may be different. And even the norms, values, and traditions in which the corporates thrive, they can be different. Therefore, this by and large, I have tried to explain what corporate governance is all about. Now we have very limited time, so I will actually not go into very much details. I will try to breeze through this topic and give you, if possible, if time permits, give you subtle examples, because examples and case study, they explain a concept. Sorry. Now, but you should also know, when you talk of corporate governance, you should also know about its genesis, as how it has evolved. That's very important for you to know, or anybody to know. Now, this is a concept which has evolved or come into vogue against a particular background. And that background was of the previous century, when we saw companies in relentless pursuit of profits. Remember, Milton Friedman, he said companies exist for profit maximization only. That was also a theory. He was a very noted economist, internationally renowned economist. And he says businesses exist for profit maximization and, of course, compliance with the accident law. So in the background of relentless pursuit of profits, and also in the background of wanton and irresponsible consumption and exploitation of natural resources, which resulted in damage to environment and ecology, this concept emerged. Also, there's another third factor, and that was there was seen to be a lot of corruption within the business. There were frequent and rampant incidents of corporate frauds, corporate scandals, which adversely affected the investors, the shareholders, the consumers, the clients, and even the employees. Now, this irresponsible, unethical, fraudulent, and even at times illegal conduct of the companies gave way to the emergence of the concept of corporate governance, because there was a public outcry against the way the business was being conducted. So much was the public outcry that a lot of initiatives were taken by international organizations, private organizations, individuals, scholars, to bring about reforms in business. And then we saw the emergence of corporate governance as a byproduct of all these developments. But these things have not stopped as yet. We still see incidents of business failure, business collapse. We still see business scandals. We still see business malpractices. They still persist in the contemporary world. Therefore, there are constant attempts being made to strengthen corporate governance standards through incremental reforms. I hope people are able to hear me, because there's some disturbance. Am I audible? Hello?
Yes, sir. You are audible. You are audible.
Sir, you are audible. Yes.
Okay, just let me know in case there's any disturbance. Right. Now, if I were to generalize, I would say that the corporate governance reforms can be categorized into falling into three broad categories. But let me qualify that these categories are not mutually exclusive. That is not something that these reforms in these categories have taken place in silos or separately. It has been a simultaneous process of reform in all these three categories. And it's a very broad categories, nothing very compartmentalized. And these categories, according to me, I mean, I've done this categorization. One is the institutional, the second is the structural, and the third is the processual. And corporate governance frameworks is continuously strengthened through incremental changes introduced in all these three categories. Now, if you see from the institutional standpoint, the first category which I mentioned, if you see from institutional standpoint, the first issue which was handled by the corporate governance was the conflict between the managers and the owners. In the business world, this was one of the earliest issues which was handled through corporate governance. The conflict between the managers and the shareholders, you can also say owners were shareholders. You know about, you are students of management, or maybe you have known about management. They're called a agency principle. So it's basically classically a case of agency problem, how the agents of these shareholders or the owners were started wielding great powers. So much so that these managers had a huge control over the board. They were even able to select the people of their own choices on the boards. So this was one beginning. In the beginning, this was a problem in corporate governance. Towards the end of the, I think, 1970s, this was to some extent institutionally resolved when the concept of independent directors gain acceptance. Now, independent directors are considered to be the custodians, the strongest pillars of corporate governance, because they exercise, or they are seen as a countervailing force or a check on the senior management which is represented on the board. But soon thereafter, after this problem was resolved, another problem cropped up, or this was the perceived conflict between the majority shareholders and the minority shareholders. This is a new set of problems which cropped up and which was tackled by corporate governance. And in case of majority shareholders, they were always wanting to have a control over running the company. And the minority shareholders, as you know, were always crying for protection from these majority shareholders. Now, after some reforms in corporate governance and institutional checks which were introduced, this problem was to a great extent resolved. But after this was resolved, another problem cropped up, another institutional problem. And that was, how do you tackle the equation between the shareholders and the stakeholders? Now the problem was of addressing the issue of interest of the shareholders versus the concerns of the stakeholders. The concept of stakeholders came. The stakeholder theory gained acceptance. Shareholders theory gave way to stakeholder theory. So therefore, the current focus of regulation in corporate governance is on how to balance the interest of the shareholders and the stakeholders. Still further development has taken place, and that is, all stakeholders and shareholders, their problems had been addressed, but one set of people had been slightly ignored over the years, and they were the creditors. The creditors were somehow, did not get the attention they deserved. And therefore, we saw a lot of incidents of business and companies where the creditors were cheated and left in the lurch. They were left in the lurch either because of wrongful trading, or through corruption, or through unethical asset stripping, as they call it, or illegal siphoning of funds from the companies for personal gains. So, but the creditors had a bad time. Sorry, somebody said something? You can please reserve your questions for the end in case you have any. Now, so the creditors is a new problem which emerged, but this problem was also resolved to a great extent when we had the insolvency and the bankruptcy code introduced or enacted in 2016. And then the responsibilities and obligations of the board of directors towards the creditors was specifically assigned and incorporated in the legislative framework. And the Supreme Court has also upheld these in the recent rulings. Supreme Court has gone a step further, and they have said that the boards and the directors, they have a fiduciary responsibility to protect the interest of the creditors. And in case they fail to protect the interest of these creditors of these companies, they are personally liable. I mean, that's an important decision they have made. And their personal assets also can be disgorged for this purpose. Now, this is a huge development. Now, we have just discussed some of the institutional developments with the concept of corporate governance. Hello? Hello?
You are audible, sir.
Well, something was displayed on my screen saying that the host has muted me. So I don't know what happened. Anyway, thank you. So now we can discuss the changes at the structural level in the area of corporate governance or corporate governance reforms in the structural sphere. Now, these included, introducing greater or better role and composition of responsibilities of business, introducing more professionalism in the board, and also ensuring board diversity. Then establishment of board committees. Board committees are very important, and some of them are mandatory for the listed companies. Then strengthening the financial and accounting systems and procedures, making the audit mechanism more robust and independent, and having a whistleblower mechanism in the companies. Now, these are all structural changes which took place. Besides this, a lot of checks and balances were introduced within the corporate sector, within the companies, and they were asked to have checks and balances to prevent incidents of corruption and fraud. Of course, that's everybody knows that, but also to prevent instances of conflict of interest. That is conflict of interest between the interest of the company and the personal interest of the key management personnel or the board members. And then checks and balances also regarding related party transactions. There should be no abuse of related party transactions. Therefore, we saw over the years that through legislation or through executive directives or through guidelines or through regulations, legal obligations were introduced in the functioning of the corporations, like they set up or they prescribe the frequency and quorum of the board meetings, and also the board committee meetings. That is clearly established now under Act. Periodicity of filing the financial statements, and the number of memberships or directorships which a person can hold in different companies, that is also now prescribed. And recently they introduced the concept or the provision that there has to be one woman director on the board of these listed companies. That is mandatory. Then they have now recently asked for rotation and change of the auditors. That also has to be changed. And even the latest one is that they have said that there has to be a separation between the positions of the chairman and the managing director, the chairman of the CEO. There has to be a separation of these two positions. Now, these are all important changes or reforms in corporate governance at the structural level, and all of them are very important. Then when we come to the third aspect, that's the processual changes in corporate governance. Now, in this category, we see new provisions being introduced, new directives being given regarding adherence to the norms of ethical business practices. Business ethics came to light, was given a lot of importance according to this. And then doing business in a responsible manner was highlighted in the processes. Conforming to a well-designed and strict code of conduct. All companies are now required to have a code of conduct, and a code of conduct for the senior management and board members is different from the code of conduct for the employees, because for the board members and the senior or the key management personnel, the code is more stringent. Then having transparency in business operations, and this is reflected in the provisions which call for the companies to have proper reporting and disclosure mechanisms and systems. They all have to report, they all have to disclose what they are doing, not only through their websites, but also through their annual reports and other reports that they have to periodically submit to various authorities. Then practicing of non-discriminatory policies towards all the stakeholders and shareholders. I mean, this is also which has been introduced, particularly the shareholders. That is no distinction between majority shareholder or minority shareholder. Then anchoring sustainability in all business operations is something which has now emerged. Now, by what do I mean by anchoring sustainability in business operations? It means addressing social and environmental concerns alongside pursuing business goals and business targets. Now, all these processes which I've talked of, they contain certain principles, and these processes and principles actually lie at the heart of corporate governance. We will see, I'll discuss cases. They constitute the core of corporate governance. If institutional mechanisms and organizational structures are important for good corporate governance, of course they are. so are the processes and procedures and the means adopted for doing this. You must have heard of justice not only being done, but also seen to have been done. Similarly, in the case of corporate governance, the means, the processes adopted for achieving the targets are also important. Now, in the world of corporate governance, a lot of reforms came about, and most of these reforms came about through either government initiatives or international organizations initiatives or private organizations initiatives. And there were certain recommendations made by the corporate leaders, also by the business leaders, by the industry leaders. And there were certain progressive ideas also, which management experts also, academic scholars also pitched in with. The lead, of course, in this, in bringing about corporate governing reforms, were taken by these advanced countries of the West, the industrialized countries, the OECD countries, the developed countries. They have taken the lead in bringing about reforms in corporate governance, because understandably, they have a more thriving corporate sector than the developing world. And hence, for that reason, they have been, or they are acutely aware of the prevalent ills, the problems, the drawbacks in the existing business world. And therefore, they are the ones who know where and what reforms are needed most compellingly. So in corporate governance also, the lead was taken by these countries, and we have a lot of initiatives being taken over the years. We will not go into details of this. We don't have the time. I don't think we have, but still I will mention in the international level, in the international context, the important initiatives which were taken was, which everybody is aware of, is the Cadbury Report of UK of, I think, 1995. The Cadbury Report is cited as one of the very important initiatives in corporate governance. And the objective of this was to how to make large public companies adopt corporate governance guidelines. And the focus was, in this particular report, was on procedures for financial reporting and the role of accounting and audit. Accounting, audit, and financial reporting were the focus. But issues such as role of the board was also discussed in this report. The standards of financial reporting, of course, accountability, of course, was discussed, accountability of the auditors, and the director's pay was also discussed in this report. It's a very important report. One of the pioneering work done in the area of corporate governance. It was followed by other reports also. I will just mention those. We had the Greenbury Report at the end of United Kingdoms of 1995, yes, which dealt with the remuneration of the executives, the directors, and also disclosures regarding the remuneration that they take. Then we have the Hampel Report of the UK again, United Kingdom again in 1998. Now they discussed in these, they issued guidelines for the role of directors and directors' compensation and role of shareholders. Broadly, similar topics were amplified and taken up for discussion and for giving up more guidelines. An important development or milestone in the evolution of corporate governance was the Sarbanes and Oxley Act of the United States. United States, this particular act of 2002 is also as important as the Cadbury Report, because the United States came up with this act. This is also known as the Public Company Accounting Reform and Investors Protection Act under the US federal law. It's a very comprehensive initiative, and many features are there. It deals with the auditor's independence. It deals with corporate responsibility, which is basically corporate social responsibility. It deals with the financial disclosures, how financial disclosure is important. It deals with the conflict of interest situations. It deals with the corporate fraud accountability of companies, white-collar crimes within the companies. So these aspects were taken up. And then finally, we had the emergence of the OECD guidelines, or OECD principles on corporate governance, 2004. This is very, very important because OECD is spread over many countries. I think 37 or 38 countries are now members of this organization. And similar is the framework in other advanced countries. So OECD guidelines are very important, and one must know about OECD principles on corporate governance. Basically, they have talk of 6 principles of corporate governance. One is the rights of the shareholders. That is always important. I mean, shareholders are the key people in a company. Then equitable treatment of all shareholders and investors. That's the another principle. Then the role of the stakeholders. It does not ignore the stakeholders also because of the importance of many key stakeholders who are as important as the shareholders. Then disclosure and transparency in business. That's another principle of corporate governance. Responsibilities of the board and its directors. Now, board is the nodal point for ensuring good corporate governance. I mean, it is the head of a company, the brain of a company lies in the board. Board is the most important organ in a company, in a corporation. Therefore, they talk of the responsibilities of the board. And finally, the sixth principle is on responsible conduct of business. By responsible conduct of business, you mean how ethical business practices should be incorporated, how it should be transparent, how it should be there should be ethical business practices, there should be accountability within that. So all these are part of responsible business conduct. Within India also, a lot of evolution took place in the field of corporate governance. And we started with, of course, the guidelines, not the guidelines, it was a voluntary code. It was basically a voluntary code which was framed by the CII, Confederation of Indian Industries. It was a voluntary guidelines way back in 1998. But the important landmark in corporate governance in India has been the Kumara Mangala Birla Committee Report of 1999. That is a huge starting point of corporate governance in India. And the features that were there on this report was that there has to be a constitution of an audit committee, there has to be a remuneration committee, and appointment of independent directors was stressed in this, that the independent directors have a very, very important role in ensuring good corporate governance, because only they can be the countervailing force against the management in the board. Then enforcement of accounting standards was mentioned in this. Then financial disclosures were also mentioned in this Kumara Mangalam Committee report. The leadership role of the chairman of a company was stressed, and the stakeholders and the shareholders both were given due importance. It was followed by other committees also, for example, the Narayan Murthy Committee report, which was, I think, a few years later. It was in 2002, I think, yes. And the Naresh Chandra Committee report, the Naresh Chandra Committee report came in 2003. And it stressed more on the auditors and the auditor company relationship, and how the auditors also need to be audited to ensure their independence and their neutrality. And the independent directors was also given a lot of focus in this narration of the committee report. But very important second milestone would be, I would say, clause 49 of the listing agreement of 2005. You must be, just check up the internet or your books or whatever reading materials you must have been given by your organization, that's the NIT, and you find that clause 49 of the listing agreement for the listed companies, that is very important, because it's very comprehensive clause containing very important features on corporate governance. It gives a definition of independent directors. And somebody saying something. Okay, disturbance had died down, so I can continue. So it talks of board committees. It talks of board committees. It talks about a code of conduct in the company for the professionals, for the board members, and for the other employees. Then it talks of the meetings of the audit committee. It talks about disclosures and transparency. It talks of report on corporate governance. Every company has to give and submit a report on its corporate governance initiatives. Then auditor certification is required, and the CEOs or CFO certification is required on compliances with the several aspects of corporate governance. Now, this is important. It was followed by, of course, by many other initiatives in India. Department of Public Enterprises guidelines came out in 2010. I mean, there were ones in 2007 also, but the DP guidelines or the Department of Public guidelines on corporate governance 2010 are important, but they had the same flavor as what was being done earlier. The stress on the various committees, audit committee, on the remuneration committee. They stressed on the responsibilities of the board, on the independent directors, on the reporting and disclosure systems, and the whistleblower mechanism. And a lot of importance was given to the code of conduct. They had several pages attached on a detailed code of conduct. Now, these are various initiatives. Finally, we have in 2013, we have the Companies Act 2013, in which corporate governance was really strengthened. And after that, in 2013, we had the SEBI's LODR regulations of 2015. That is the listing obligations and disclosure regulations of SEBI. SEBI has been giving instructions after that also. Later on, SEBI gave the instructions that all the top companies, 500 companies, which was later on modified to or changed to 1,000 companies, they have to give reports, business responsibility reports. I must tell you that in 2018, the government of India have come out with the national guidelines on responsible business conduct. We have a provision of corporate social responsibility incorporated in the Companies Act, and the Ministry of Corporate Affairs has issued rules thereunder. But in 2018, we had the national guidelines on responsible business conduct. Previously, there were national voluntary guidelines on the economic, social, and environmental responsibilities of business. And SEBI had been insisting that the companies have to submit their business responsibility reports on what they were doing on these national voluntary guidelines. But now that they have the national voluntary guidelines have changed to national guidelines on responsible business conduct, SEBI insists that the top 1,000 companies, they submit their business responsibility reports. And the latest is that they have changed the nomenclature of these reports, and the content of this report has also changed according to SEBI directives. Now the companies are required to give business responsibility and sustainability reports. It's called BRSR now from 2021. Now, all these are initiatives for strengthening corporate governance, strengthening the institutional mechanism, strengthening the structural mechanisms, and giving importance to the principles and processes also. They also find place in this. So we have a huge initiative being taken by India also to promote corporate governance in the companies. Now, we should also know what are the agencies, organizations, or instrumentalities which try to exercise supervision over the compliance of corporate governance norms and these rules and regulations. Now, there are various agencies which exercise regulation. You have, for example, the Companies Act itself is the Bible, in the way. And you have to go and all companies have to conform with the guidelines, with the provisions. They're not the guidelines, that's the law. They have to follow the rules which are provided for in the Companies Act. SEBI also is one of the regulator, you can say. The Ministry of Corporate Affairs has the overarching powers to issue directives to all companies, including matters related to corporate governance. It's a regulator that way. The Department of Public Enterprises has the mandate to issue policy directives to the central public sector undertakings. So see, as far as public sector is concerned, DP is also very important. Initially, till 1 year back, Department of Public Enterprises was in a different ministry, and Ministry of Corporate Affairs was a different ministry. Now, of course, both the Ministry of Corporate Affairs and the Department of Public Enterprises, they are headed by the Finance Minister. DP has now officially come under Ministry of Finance. So it is hoped that there will be greater synchronization, greater coordination, greater compatibility between the instructions issued by Ministry of Corporate Affairs and the Department of Public Enterprises. Now, talking of these regulations and these instrumentalities regarding regulation of corporate governance standards, you also have the accounting standards issued by the Institute of Chartered Accountants. They have issued their own accounting standards, which all companies have to adhere to. And you have the secretarial standards issued by the Institute of Company Secretaries of India. These secretarial standards are also to be complied with. It's clearly mentioned in the rules that they have to be complied with. In the case of the public sector undertakings, you also have the Comptroller and Auditor General. Their office is there to review the performance of all public sector enterprises, and the C&AG submits an annual report which is tabled in the Parliament on the performance of the PSUs. And there's a separate chapter on corporate governance. That's what I'm trying to stress. There's a separate chapter in the report on the corporate governance performance of the public sector companies. Of course, the C and AG cannot cover all the PSUs. Central PSUs cannot be covered because that's enormous work. So they randomly pick up some companies. Normally they pick up around 50 odd companies in a year. They go into depth of their corporate governance performance and then submit the report. But it's a regulatory body, you can say that. Now, I'm giving you the framework of the regulatory framework, which is existing in India. But I must also comment as to how effective it is. Otherwise, I will not be really doing justice to this topic. Now, the rules, regulations, norms of corporate governance as stipulated in the Companies Act or in the SEBI and the directives given by SEBI, particularly the LODR regulations, that's a listing obligation and disclosure regulations, and the guidelines issued by the Department of Public Enterprises. All these guidelines have been condensed, or you can say, amalgamated and brought together in a one checklist for mandatory compliance for the companies. So we have a checklist for ensuring that corporate governance is being adhered to by these companies. They have a checklist. What does this checklist have? It's a ready checklist. I mean, the companies, it's easier for the companies also then, and for the regulatory agencies also then, to check the standards of corporate governance. They talk of this checklist includes board compositions, its responsibilities, its functioning, the presence of the composition and responsibilities of the independent directors, the frequency of board meetings, how frequently these board meetings take place, whether they are taking place or not. Then you have the frequency of the board committee meetings also, professionalism and diversity of the board. Lot of emphasis is given to the responsibilities of the board, the functioning of the board, the composition of the board. This is in the checklist. Then, as I mentioned, board committees also, their composition and functioning is very important and forms part of this checklist. Audit mechanisms. What is the audit mechanisms which have been adopted by the companies? Who are the auditors? How the auditors have been selected? Then protection of the interest of the shareholders. How is that protection ensured in a company? That mechanism is a part of the checklist. Protecting the interest of shareholders, especially the minority shareholders. Then how the company has devised a mechanism, or what safeguard has it provided for avoiding or checking instance of conflict of interest. Conflict of interest is a huge issue in corporate governance, because many a times the interest of the board members or key management personnel, the personal interest clashes with the interest of the company, and that leads to corruption. That's very obvious. And there have been instances of board members and senior people being held responsible for this. Then in the checklist, you also have the mechanisms which a company has to adopt or put in place for related party transactions. Related party transactions are a very important issue which needs to be looked into, and it needs to be addressed by all companies. Disclosure mechanisms to ensure transparency, that is also part of the checklist. What are the disclosure and reporting mechanisms that a company has adopted? And very detailed information is given in this checklist. This checklist has very detailed information as to what is required for this purpose. And of course, the corporate social responsibility. CSR is now firmly ingrained in the Companies Act. Section 135 of the Companies Act talks of corporate social responsibility, and it's the law of the land, and all companies are supposed to actually discharge their corporate social responsibility in the manner prescribed by the Act and by the CSR rules of the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. Now, this broadly speaking are you can say this covers almost everything. Of course, you may say that, but yes, they certainly cover the important aspects of corporate governance, certainly. Now, primarily, it is the responsibility of the board and the key management personnel, KMPs as we call them, to ensure compliance with the corporate governance rules and regulations and ensuring adherence to the corporate governance norms and principles. The board is responsible. Main responsibility is of the board. Now, problems therefore arise. Problems arise when the board abdicates this responsibility or falters in discharging this responsibility. Then the problems arise in corporate governance. Yes. And before we come to that, before I give you some examples, let me also tell you how these regulatory agencies like the CNAG and the SEBI, they work and what do they see. I just mentioned what do they see and how do they see, I mentioned just now. But I don't know if any of you has gone through the CNAG reports. It makes a good reading if you go through the CNAG reports. They submit these reports every year to the parliament. And the chapter on corporate governance is also always quite revealing. I personally read this report almost every year. And I will give you my observations, therefore, on the how CNAG, looks into the performance of the PSUs and what exactly does it assess from these various parameters and from this checklist that is available for seeing whether the companies have performed according to the requirements of corporate governance. And my honest opinion is, this is my honest opinion, that I am a little disappointed with the reports that are submitted by the Comptroller and Auditor General. It's a constitutional authority, and I respect that constitutional authority, but I am slightly disappointed. The reason is that the reports which are submitted by the Comptroller and Auditor General are more of data collection. They are data collection exercise, or they give a statistical assessment of the various checklists that have been provided, the checklist that has been provided. It is a statistical assessment. For example, in the reports that I see year after year, they talk of whether there are requisite number of independent directors on the board of a company. They always say that. They mark out the companies in which the number of independent directors are falling short. How many vacancies are there on the board? And since when the vacancies are lying, for the 1 year or 2 years or 4 months or 5 months, they specify that. In this report, they also specify whether the meetings of the independent directors is taking place or not. Independent directors are supposed to meet separately also just by themselves. Is that meeting taking place or not? Are the directors, independent directors, particularly attending the board meetings, and how many board meetings they have skipped? And stuff like this. I mean, this is the information that they give. Because why they focus on independent directors? Remember, independent directors are the bastion or pillar of corporate governance, good corporate governance, not the management director, not the functional directors. It's the independent directors. So they give you data on whether they have attended the board meetings or not, how many board meetings have been skipped. They also give you data on whether the independent directors have been given the requisite training or not, whether they have been trained or not. They give you so many directors have not been trained. They will give you that data. Whether the audit committee is meeting as frequently as is stipulated, the number of meetings which are prescribed in a year, are they meeting that many times? Is it meeting that they will give? Now they will also see whether the audit committee has sat to review the performance of the auditors or not. The data they will give. Whether the audit committee has sat and reviewed the functioning of the whistleblower mechanism. If 2 meetings are held, they will give 2 meetings held. If none has been held, they will give you none has been held. Now this data is certainly very important. I don't undermine the importance of this data. It provides you an insight into the structural and legal obligations of the corporate governance framework of a company. But is it enough, my dear friends? My question is it enough? I am afraid the quality of corporate governance cannot be really assessed by such data. The number of board meetings attended, the number of vacancies, since when the vacancy, blah, blah, blah. This will give you an idea as to how serious they are. Maybe it will give you an idea how serious the board is or the company is about adhering to the legislative requirements or regulatory requirements of corporate governance, but the quality of corporate governance will not be captured in this. Now, for example, when you talk of the meetings, the number of meetings may indicate how often the matter was discussed. But without knowing what was the agenda of that meeting, what was the detailed agenda of this meeting, how much serious deliberation took place on each of the points in that agenda, particularly related to corporate governance, and what was the decisions that were taken, and what were the considerations for taking those decisions, how did they arrive at those decisions, how can you understand whether a full consideration was given to corporate governance or not? So therefore, you cannot comment on the quality of corporate governance just by this statistical data. It is important. I'm not denying the importance of what is being done and, for the sake of assessment, but we are falling short somewhere. And this cannot be captured by such reports. Then this is for public sector undertakings. What about the other private companies and for the entire corporate sector? SEBI is there, as I just mentioned. SEBI is the market regulator. And I told you just now that all companies, not all, sorry, I stand corrected, 1,000 top companies, top 1,000 companies on basis of market capitalization, they are supposed to be, which are listed, they are supposed to be giving their business responsibility and sustainability reports. And submission of these reports is mandatory for them. In this, they touch upon all the important aspects of corporate governance. Let me tell you, I have seen these reports also. The format is available. You can see the format which is available on the internet. That is there for you to see. And these reports are supposed to be based on the ESG framework. SEBI has insisted that the companies follow the ESG framework. The E stands for environment, S stands for social, and G stands for governance. G is governance. Governance is important. Although everything comes under governance, even E and S come under governance according to me, because they are important aspects of corporate governance. Now, surely the reports which companies submit, these business responsibility and sustainability reports, are more comprehensive and detailed than the reports submitted by the Comptroller and Auditor General. They're more detailed, certainly. But with due apologies and with clear disclaimer, and there's a clear disclaimer before I comment, that I really don't know how carefully these reports are read and assessed by the SEBI authorities. I do not know that. I know only the format of that, and what the companies submit, I know, but how carefully they are read and understood or assessed, I don't know. But I feel, on the basis of the formatting, I feel that even these reports cannot capture the quality of corporate governance. Many a times a stick box approach in this also. Many a times they have to give a narrative also, a descriptive part is also there. But this itself, I do not think will be able to capture the true spirit and purpose of corporate governance. The true spirit and of corporate governance is immersed in its principles, and principles of responsible, ethical, transparent, and transparent business conduct in respect to all shareholders, and with sustainably anchored in all the business operations and taking into account social and environmental issues. Now, these spirit cannot be captured by such reports. The true expression of this commitment to corporate governance principles is displayed and demonstrated. It's displayed and demonstrated through voluntary action done by the business leaders, rather than through compliance with the mandated regulations. Whenever you do something out of compliance of certain mandated regulations, then the whole essence is gone, the spirit is gone. Something which you do voluntarily captures the essence better. I am very much inclined to agree with what was once said by the chairman of the Confederation of Indian Industries National Council on Corporate Governance. The chairman mentioned something, and I remember his words. I completely agree with him. He said corporate governance goes far beyond the provisions of company law and SEBI regulations. And he said that the quantity, quality, and frequency of disclosures, and even the extent to which the board exercises their fiduciary responsibility, and the commitment of the board to ensure that they conduct business in a transparent manner, is something, he said, which cannot be legislated in any level of detail. It can't be legislated any level of detail. It is something, he said, and I totally agree, which is to be seen from the work of progressive business leaders. What they do voluntarily to enhance transparency and responsibility, what they do actually is from what you see the spirit of the corporate governance. I mean, it is from their action, voluntary action, that you can see that this is company is doing well, and not simply by complying with the law. Compliance with the law will never give you the true picture. Therefore, there's still a debate going on, in some quarters of the business world, in India and abroad, of course, that what is the best model of corporate governance? What are the best practices in corporate governance? It is true that there are no standards or no fixed standards or matrices or indices to determine the degree of success of any given set of corporate governance principles. That is true. But I must say, let me qualify, the compliance with the checklist or the mandatory requirements or regulations on corporate governance, the ones I mentioned now, is useful, is helpful, but it has its limitations. This is my comment. It has its limitations in terms of effectiveness. Complete reliance on the overarching principles or set of principles or tenets of corporate governance without any binding rules for the companies to supplement such principles also has its shortcomings. So if you say that you will only comply by the principles, that is also has its shortcomings. And going by simply the legislated regulations also, it has its shortcomings. So that is why many companies have adopted the middle path or the middle approach. They have a set of principles, they have a checklist, they have rules and regulations regarding the corporate governance, they have structures, institutional mechanisms, and others, regulations in place to ensure good corporate governance practices within the country, within the company. But they also have they also lay a lot of importance to the allegiance to the principles of corporate governance. They always tell the companies to please have allegiance or pay allegiance to the principles of corporate governance, and which are, as I told you, in case of OECD guidelines or OECD principles, they are transparency, accountability, integrity, ethical conduct, fair decision making, and protection of the interest of all stakeholders, of all shareholders. All these are important principles. So the principles or the tenets of corporate governance should always be the leading light. All should be the leading light in corporate governance. And SEBI also has said this. I mean, SEBI has acknowledged this. And SEBI has acknowledged this and clearly stated, in the case of a conflict between the principles of corporate governance and the language of the law, in case of a conflict between the principles of corporate governance and the language of the law, the principles will prevail. They also recognize the importance of the principles. So, having said this, I will say that the business world is still facing a lot of or witnessing a lot of business scandals, business frauds, corporate governance failures every now and then. And that is precisely because the principles of corporate governance are not firmly ingrained in the corporate work culture of those companies. They are not adhering to the principles of corporate governance. Of course, they're flouting the rules and regulations also, but they have the complete disregard for the principles of the corporate governance. And the board is to a great extent responsible for that. Now, let us see what are the few cases that we can see in the last 1 decade or so. The important cases in India. I will not say go for the international examples. I have many, but I don't have the time. Now, we saw the classic case of Satyam Collapse. Satyam collapsed in 2009. We saw the Ranbaxy Labs also collapse somewhere around that time in 2009. 2012, we saw the collapse of Kingfisher. We saw the collapse of Reebok India. I don't know whether you heard of Reebok India, but it was a huge corporate governance failure case. 2018, I don't know, remember the name of the company, but we had the Nirav Modi's case also, this company collapsed. 2019, Jet Airways collapsed. 2020, Yes Bank collapsed. These important examples I've given you of collapse of these big companies, big time companies. And these are cases of corporate governance failures. In all these cases, the shareholders, the investors, the creditors, all were taken for a ride. These are the cases where the employees, many cases where the employees did not get salaries for months. These are the cases where there were in some many companies, very eminent professionals were on the board. They were independent directors on the board of these companies. And still this collapse happened. This is a case, these are all cases of complete failure of the boards. These are cases of complete failure of the audit mechanisms of the auditors of these companies. In almost all these cases, we see fudging of the records, fudging of the books of account, falsification of financial statements. We see siphoning of the revenue and the profits of the company for personal gains. In short, complete collapse within the company, and because there were no checks and balances within the company, or even if there were any checks and balance mechanisms, they were completely disregarded. They were completely ignored. Now, these were not cases of mismanagement. Don't confuse this with mismanagement. These were not cases of error of judgment in commercial decision making. They were not cases of oversight or negligence in decision making. They were not cases of simple corruption or malpractices. They were cases of stark corporate governance failures. And now, these are some of the private cases. I mean, I don't have to tell you what they are, or these companies have been doing. I mean, it's all over the newspapers and you must be reading about them. But please don't get the impression that only the private sector sees or has witnessed corporate governance failures. But the public sector is no better. But it is true that we have not heard of such dramatic collapse of the public sector companies. We have not seen that in public sector as we have seen in the case of private sector. But certainly in the public sector also, there is a rot within. There is a rot within. And I know there is. The difference is that in the case of the public sector, corporate governance failure in the public sector, the news does not really leak out very easily. You don't get to know those cases. The government always steps in for damage control at the right point of time, or the news is just kept under the wraps. I mean, you don't come to know. I speak very confidently when I say this because I have done research on this subject. And although my research on the subject was done more than a decade back, the results of my research were very revealing, even to me. I can share that with you. I'm not supposed to give you the names of the companies. I've been sworn to secrecy for that because it's the public sector undertakings, and the Central Vigilance Commission of India, for the first time, they allowed me to access these records, which they normally don't do. For my research, they are allowed. Now, I happen to examine 63 cases of central public sector undertakings where the board members and the key management personnel were personally involved in grave irregularities, grave misconduct, great scams, corruption cases. And in all such cases, the irregularities which were noticed by the Vigilance Department of these central public sector undertakings, on the basis of their report, the CVC, the Central Vigilance Commission, advised issuance of major penalty charge sheet to all the accused people. And all these cases, most of these cases at least, were worthy of being taken up for criminal prosecution against the people. Yet nothing was done. It never reached that stage. In fact, even the disciplinary action that was sought to be initiated or taken against these people was scuttled. It was aborted by none other than the boards of these PSUs themselves. On very flimsy grounds, they aborted the process, saying that the people who had done this malpractice, so-called malpractice, they said, was actually done in the best in commercial interest of the company, or perhaps they were cases of simple, cases of not proper application of mind, lack of proper application of mind in decision making. Come on. I mean, I've seen the cases, I've seen the gravity of the situation and the gravity of the cases. They were cases of rampant corruption, huge, very, very huge losses running into millions and millions of dollars in some cases. And there were rules and procedures were completely flouted. Favoritism was openly and brazenly shown to certain parties, illegal acts done brazenly. And sometimes there was very clear documentary evidence of corruption and fraud, yet no action was taken. This was quite an eye opener for me too. So don't talk of only these kingfishers and these other businesses collapsing. Public sector also has its black sheep. Now, the board members, the point I'm trying to make is that the board members, the chairman, the managing director, the other members of the board, the senior management, key management personnel, who are supposed to be the custodians and promoters of corporate governance, were found to be in these public sector undertakings, which I researched, were found to be themselves responsible for the collapse of these companies. And so in the case of private companies also, the board was responsible for the collapse. Now, if they are the people responsible, or the custodians of corporate governance, and if they themselves try to indulge in such practices, then God help the company. There's bound to be collapse of corporate governance failures. But before that, let me sum up and say that these are exceptional cases. I mean, before you get me wrong, these are exceptional cases. I do not wish to paint every company with a black tar. I mean, they are good companies. These were exceptional cases. There are very large number of good companies also in the private sector and public sector, both, which are consistently adhering to the corporate governance regulations, and they are adopting good corporate governance practices. They're adhering to the corporate governance norms also, and norms and practices which at times go beyond the requirement of law. There are good companies which are doing it, both in the private sector and public sector. But I just gave you some insight into the cases where corporate governance completely collapsed. So what is the takeaway from all this discussion? My time is running out. I'm keeping an eye. One eye of mine is on the watch, so I have very limited time. So what's our take on this? Our take is that there have been certain very progressive reforms, no doubt. There have been progressive reforms in corporate governance in the recent times. And if I were to be asked as to what are the important reforms that have taken place, one, of course, has been the enhancement of professionalism of the board. Yes, steps have been taken repeatedly regarding this. The introduction of women directors on the board is a very healthy development. I can inform you that in case of OECD countries, the women representation on the board is more than 25%. So for the purpose of bringing about gender diversity and having a more balanced board, it's a good step to have a women directors on board. Another important step which has been wisely taken is having a qualifying exams for the independent directors. The Ministry of Corporate Affairs has introduced this. Earlier, anybody could be appointed as an independent director, particularly in private companies. At least in the public sector companies, they used to examine the record, and there were some categories like chartered accountants or professionals or domain experts. I have been a part of that process, so I know. Yes, they used to give importance to the qualifications of the people who were seeking appointment of the boards as independent directors. But in the private companies, matters were completely really messy. But now they have introduced this, qualifying exam. They have to pass an exam. That's a good thing. At least some professionalism has been introduced at the independent director level also, which is a very important institution of corporate governance. Then the submission of the business responsibility and sustainability reports, which we just discussed, is a very important step. The separation of position between the chairman and the managing director, or the chairman and the CEO, is a very important step, which will come into play or in effect from this year, from 1st April 2022. This is considered to be very important. This is the dominant trend actually in OECD countries, UK, Australia, and other developed countries. This is the progress. This is the trend, having these two separated. And the reason is there needs to be a very balanced governance structure within the board. There should be no overlapping of the board and the management. These are two different things. Board and management should not be convergence in that sense. There should not be no overlapping, and there should be avoidance of conflict of interest, because the board of management has the functional directors and also the independent directors. They also have the nominee directors, and they have the non-executive directors. So the separation of the powers of the position of chairman and MD is a progressive step. Otherwise, what we have generally see that the functional director becomes the chairman. So you have the management as the head of the board. Now, it's a good step which has been taken. And I would also say another good step which has been taken is the enactment of the insolvency and the bankruptcy code, which has led to the great importance being given to the creditors of a company, which was something which was ignored all this time. And finally, I would say the important thing has been to include corporate social responsibility in the Companies Act, and the stringent CSR rules framed thereunder by the Ministry of Corporate Affairs have made the corporates become aware of their social and environmental responsibilities. If followed in letter and spirit, this regulation that's on CSR can strongly fortify the foundations and edifice of the corporate governance in India. And now there is a flip side to it also. Now, whatever I said, there's a flip side to it. Considering the enormity of the responsibilities which have been thrust on the board, a lot of responsibilities have now been thrust on the board of the companies now, coupled with the provisions of personal liability and penalty in case of default or in the case of failure, in case of CSR also, if the provisions are not complied with, it can lead to penalty. Huge penalty is imposed. There was one time when they were talking of imprisonment also. Fortunately, that provision was dropped. That amendment was dropped. They were thinking of sending them to jail. Now that is reduced to simple penalty. So that is there. In the case of the fiduciary responsibility towards the interest of the creditors also, as the Supreme Court has ruled, the personal assets of the independent of the individual directors can also be attached. Now, because of these developments, the many professionals, knowledgeable people are now shying away from becoming independent directors on the board of companies. There are no safe havens for the independent directors. And their argument is, why are they not wanting to join? Good people are not want to join as independent directors on the boards. Their argument is that their responsibilities are not matching or not not concomitant with their powers. They have very limited powers. They say we hardly have any powers. This is their refrain. We do not have powers even to get vital information. We have limited access to information. The information that is provided by the board to these independent directors, by the management, can be filtered, can be incomplete, which is actually a fact at times. So how can we be responsible in case we are not fully informed of these, fully informed of what's going on? Therefore, the strongest pillars of the corporate governance in companies are the independent directors, and these independent directors are now these people are now reluctant to continue on the boards. Many have resigned, and many good people are not wanting to become. This will surely give corporate governance a hit. I am myself an independent on the board of 3 companies, so I know the responsibilities. I am also scared, and I do not want to join more boards. And people, many people are there. I mean, so therefore, friends, I think I have just now 1 minute left according to my watch, 1 or 2 minutes left. So I'll sign off here. And thank you very much for a very patient hearing. I had plenty of things to share. A lot of things are there in corporate governance, but the time was a constraint. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir, for your informative and descriptive lecture. Thank you, really.
So we do have a few of the questions in the chat box. Like, how can a researcher evaluate the functioning and commitment of the board besides the basics available from the annual reports which are there?
It is to some extent a matter of perception. Number one, perception is important, and you can always make out. For example, I can give you the companies, Tata's, for example. I mean, their corporate governance is impeccable. I mean, you can see for yourself how committed they are. The employees themselves will tell you, the employees are the greatest advocates of the performance of a company. You see the how happy they are, and there are surveys have taken place in which the employees have said that they are willing to continue working for such companies even if their salaries were to be lowered. Such surveys have taken place, and many people have said that they would settle for a lesser salary provided they get an opportunity to work in certain companies. So reputation matters, and it all comes out. Very soon it comes out. You can't keep it under wraps for too long. But you have to see many things besides these regulatory aspects. You have to see, for example, their commitment. Is it the commitment only a token commitment, or is it a genuine commitment? You can see from their acts with how they treat their customers, their clients, their stakeholders. So within the company, what they're doing, at times you may not be able to see. But as a stakeholder, you can see how responsible they are, how responsive they are towards the social and environmental concerns. That is a very important indicator. Their response towards social and environmental concerns. That will tell you how good a company or bad a company is towards responsible conduct. And how, if you see any skeletons coming out of the cupboard, and you see some kind of a messy litigation of a company, you can always see that there is no corporate governance. So the parameters are very wide. Yes.
One question is there, like as you have mentioned also about the many cases of failure of corporate governance. So the question is, like, consequences of the misconduct are spread across like any company which do some misconduct. It is spread across all the stakeholders. Why the process is so slow?
Process is so slow.
Yes, sir. Like penalty, etc. Why it is so slow?
No, I mean, law has to take its own course. They also have to be given a chance to be heard and to defend themselves. So I cannot comment on the pace of the law, but certainly the law is there, and you have the various avenues for redressal of your grievances. I mean, there you have the courts, you have the law tribunals also. So these are there. I mean, the avenues are there. People don't avail it. That's a different matter. And incidentally, I mean, to answer your question, and particularly the question which was asked earlier, I didn't have the time to actually dwell on it, but we now have a scoreboard. There is now a scoreboard available. Indian corporate governance scoreboard is available. You can access. You can actually, if a research is done, you can access. You can have access to information, and you can assess their corporate governance performance. This was a scoreboard which was established or which was developed by the International Finance Corporation, IFC, and the Bombay Stock Exchange. And it was launched in December 2016. I have gone through that report. There's a scoreboard. It's quite good. And it comprises of 70 questionnaires. They have asked the companies 70 questionnaires. So it's not one question which will answer you or give you an insight on the corporate governance, but a lot of huge questionnaires are there. And they have broadly categorized all the 70 questions into 4 broad categories. One is regarding the rights and equitable treatment of the shareholders. The second category is of these stakeholders. And the third is on disclosure and transparency. And the fourth is on the responsibilities of the board. So I don't have the time to discuss those. For example, on the basis of a survey conducted of 30 companies, on the basis of this scoreboard of corporate governance, they came out with their findings that out of 30 companies only, that 7% of these companies displayed good leadership role in corporate governance. 43 were rated as good. For 33% were rated as fair in corporate governance, and 17% were rated as basic. They stopped short of calling them poor, so they politely said it's basic. But otherwise, they have categorized. And in doing the grading of corporate governance also, they found, surprisingly to me also, that institutionally owned companies had better governance score than the others. It was followed by the multinational companies, and the third category was the companies which came third was, I remember, the family-owned companies, and the last category was the public sector companies. So they did the grading also. So this is something which is nascent. It's still nascent. How to really assess the corporate governance scoreboard of a company. But this is one of the attempts made by this pioneering work done by the International Finance Corporation, the Bombay Stock Exchange.
So is it available online, this scoreboard you're talking about, sir?
I have a copy with me. So I got it.
It will be really helpful for our participants if you can share across the link or something.
I will try to, because I got it straight from the people who had formulated this. I got it from the International Finance Corporation. Yes.
So there is one last question, sir. In some of the organizations, relatives of the owners, in some of the organizations, relative of the owners are placed in the position of directors. What do you think? How much it is ethical?
It is certainly not ethical. Yes, it's certainly not ethical. And it certainly does compromise the ethical business practices. It compromises the corporate governance of that company. But I totally agree. But since they have the powers, they can do so. But I completely agree. It's not very ethical. It's not proper to have. That is why the greatest check on this is the independent directors. Independent directors, if they perform their role well, I can tell you the independent directors also are under constraint. They also at times don't act independently. Their independence is also compromised. That is a different issue altogether. I can give you a lecture on the independence of independent directors. I have done that. So I can give you provisions, rules, and regulations also. I can give you cases how their independence has been compromised. So they're scared. They're a scared lot, many of them, because of so much of provisions in the company law and in these rules and regulations which call for punitive action against the board members, including the independent directors. And also they owe so much to the people who actually appoint them as independent directors. So out of allegiance to the owners, I mean, how can you go against the owners in private companies? We are appointed an independent director. Your independence is compromised from day one. I mean, you get appointed and you say, thank you so much for appointing me. And there you are.
Due to the shortage of time, we are like not taking other questions, but
Okay.
Honestly speaking, it was really a very informative and enriching session, sir. Might be the time is a constraint. This should be a very elongated session for at least 2 or more hours. But due to the shortage of time, we are extremely sorry, all the participants, and to you too, sir. It has been a really informative session, sir.
We can meet again sometime.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.